So our first question for tonight goes, Dear Lumpur, some people say that the great Thai teacher Ajahn Chah was incapacitated by terrible health, numerous strokes, and paralysis from middle age of about 63 years old. Some also say that as his illness worsened, Ajahn Chah would use his body as a teaching, a living example of the impermanence of all things. Is this all true? And if so, should householders or lay people use similar reflections when they are sick?
Well, I can't speak for Ajahn Chah in terms of what his mind was doing, his intention during his illness. What you said is correct in the fact that he became ill around the age of 60. He started to go downhill very fast. And there's a whole range of symptoms he had, and the symptoms got worse because he was ill for about 10 years or even over. We gradually lost the ability to use his muscles and his body, although he was at the beginning still able to move a bit and swallow food, but his memory was going. It's basically a kind of stroke and damage to the brain, so his memory was going, so he stopped speaking because he kept slurring his speech. He had many problems with his lungs. Lungs would constantly be filling up with phlegm. He had diabetes, he had nervous system problems, a whole range of illnesses. Eventually he had, infected bladder, infections in his body as it got weaker and weaker over this period of 10 years. None of that was intentional. That's just the way the human body is. As you get old, you get diseases. You could say it's all a result of past karma, but he's not the only person in the world who gets old and sick. Everybody does. If you live to an old age, you get sick, sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot. Some people more sick than Ajahn Chah, some less. So I'm not sure that he was deliberately being sick or old to teach others, but because he was a teacher and everyone focused on him through their lives, everyone who knew him and was around him saw him as a teacher, naturally his physical condition became the teaching when he stopped teaching verbally. He was no longer saying anything, but just being with him, seeing his slow degeneration of his body was a teaching. There's no doubt about that. And because Ajahn Chah's mind was very peaceful, he had a very peaceful presence that most people could feel, and his mind is like this mind of the unconditioned. We believe he was a fully awakened arahant. If an arahant is there, even if they're not speaking, even if they're physically weak and ill, their mind has an amazing effect on the people around them. Just the atmosphere is very special. And because people had lived with him for many years, trained with him for many years, and not just monks, but laity as well, there was a whole reverence for him and a whole recollection of Ajahn Chah, the teacher, and what he had taught, the practice of sila, samadhi, panya, meditation, but also morality and basic monastic training and practices. That was all there, and he brought that out in people. So even though at the end he wasn't speaking, there were many things good things that came out for the rest of us who were with him towards the end of his life. But Ajahn Chah personally must have been under great, having to use great endurance and patience to be with a body that was so weak and probably painful much of the time. Many people believe he used his ability with samadhi and insight, the purity of his mind, to kind of boost the body or keep it going a bit longer than maybe normally it would have lasted. The doctors predicted when he first became ill, he had his stroke. They did an operation on his brain, which seemed to make things worse, unfortunately. But the doctors at that time predicted he wouldn't last more than a year. And even other monks said he won't last more than a year, but he lasted another 10 years. And I personally and other monks I know were with him at different times where he seemingly used his samadhi, particularly practice of and skill in jhana, to revitalize his body at times where it was under great stress, and either through illness, weakness, the failing of different organs and so on. He seemed to be able to revive himself on a number of occasions. I think there was twice I was with him for about 7 or 8 years. And there was twice that I remember where he went into hospital. He was so weak and his blood pressure was right down, his pulse was right down. Everything seemed to be packing up, and the doctors were saying, this is it, he's going to die. And he was there for a few days and he seemed very weak and pale, and everyone was prepared for the worst. And then slowly but surely he seemed to come out of it to the point where he could return to the monastery and carry on for another year or two. So, and that seemed to happen a couple of times. So most of the teachers who are skilled in meditation and samadhi and seem to have at least some idea of where Ajahn Chah's mind was at, felt that he was consciously using his practice to keep himself going as long as possible. In the end, he couldn't, there's a finite point where this body, however much samadhi you have, however much your mind is experiencing the unconditioned, a body is a body. Eventually, its impermanence will display itself. But until that point, he was very much a focus for the community, the monks and the laity. So he did a great service, an amazing service, by staying alive, because it gave the chance for people to constantly come and visit him, practice with him, come together around him while he was alive. I don't think anyone was complaining. He himself must have endured a lot of pain and discomfort, but the rest of us were fortunate that he was still alive through those last years, and he didn't just die straight away. It was a great thing for the rest of the community. So his life from start to finish as a monk was a teaching in so many ways, but obviously in the earlier part, he was teaching by talking and leading by example, doing things, practicing with the community. At the very end, he was more static, either bedridden or in a wheelchair. And the teaching became more subtle and more by inference, with him as an aging, sick monk was still a teaching, but it was not a direct, teaching through words and actions. It was more just you observe him aging and sick. But it was still teaching right to the end, I would say. And I learned many invaluable lessons from him right to the end.
Another question. Bante, you mentioned the 5 original disciples of the Buddha. We have heard about Venerable Kondanya and Asaji. Do we know about who the other 3 are, and what did the 5 disciples accomplish after Buddha sent them off to promote the Dhamma?
It's a big question. What we know about them is mainly from the commentaries more than the suttas, and the commentaries come after the life of the Buddha. But there are other ones such as Mahanama, Wapa, and Badia. Yeah. So they all became enlightened within a few weeks of hearing the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. They later heard the Anattalakkana Sutta, and very quickly they were all enlightened. And as you say, the first 60 enlightened disciples of the Buddha, so more than the first 5, there were others who joined quite quickly. First 60 were sent off to give teachings, to take their enlightened experience and their understanding of what is the path and the fruit out to other people in India, going in different directions. And the Buddha said, go in different directions for the benefit of the majority, the many folk. If they had all stayed together with the Buddha, that would have been amazing in a way, to have so many arahants staying with the Buddha, but then less people would have encountered the Dhamma. So the Buddha encouraged them to go in different directions. And that sort of characteristics of monks has carried on right till today. Monks, sometimes they go wandering to places where other monks haven't been, or not been very often. Monks will often, once they are established in their own practice and they know how to practice well, they will often go off, and some group of people near or far will maybe invite them to settle, practice in a certain place, build a monastery or something around them. As happened to me, I was invited to come to Melbourne, Australia, even though I'm British, and I lived in Thailand for 18 years, and I had no plans to build a monastery or live and practice in Australia. It happened. The invitation came and I accepted, and I've ended up in Melbourne. And that's happened. Now there are Buddhist monks and nuns living in the far-flung corners of the world, literally all over the world, different continents, different countries, different areas. And that's for the benefit of many people. Of course, the important thing is those 60 arahants were arahants, so they really understood the path of practice. They were solid, firm in their own practice, individual practice. And the teachings they gave were good teachings because those teachings were coming from an enlightened mind. So that's something to bear in mind. But also we know the first 60, and indeed the 80 leading arahant disciples of the Buddha, they all had special qualities, but they were all slightly different. They all had the same experience. They were all arahants. They all had the same experience of nibbana, the unconditioned, the mind free from defilement. They all had that in common. But their character, their way of practice, their mode of practice, their character varied. So Mahanama, Wapa, Bhadia, Sariputta Moggallana, Ananda, Mahakassapa, Sivali. There's so many names we still know, and that's amazing in itself that we still know their names after 2,500 years. I don't think people in this day and age, our names are going to still be known in 2,500 years. You never know, maybe, but these arahants coming from a time without the written word, generally speaking, nobody was writing, there's no technology. We still know their names. That's amazing. But they all had different skills, qualities. Sariputta and Moggallana, a good example, even though they're not in that first group of 5, but they're just a good example to consider. Sariputta, foremost in panya, in wisdom, loved to analyze the Dhamma, break the Dhamma down into its component parts. And he's very good. They call Sariputta the one who sort of brings people into the Sangha by explaining the Buddhist teachings to newcomers and people seeking the Buddhist path. Moggallana was famous for his skill in jhana and psychic powers, and had amazing psychic powers and the ability to do all kinds of things with his mind. So those are 2 arahants, but they have completely different characters and different skill sets. And that's the same for all the arahants, including those first 5. But actually, the first five, there's not a lot of, in the commentaries, in the text, there's not a lot of information about them, maybe because they were the first, and arahants who came along later, we know more about them. Perhaps they were more fashionable, or more stories, more things were said about them, more insights. Venerable Kondanya, the very first one who became a Sotapanna, listening to the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, they say he went off into the jungles of the foothills of the Himalayas and was almost never heard of again. There's, the very briefest mentions of him again after that. Perhaps that's a reflection on his character, that he loved peace and quiet and solitude. And some monks were more reclusive, like the solitude of the forest. And if that's the case, then you don't hear about them so much. There's less stories, less teaching stories, and less events. Whereas other monks, say like Ananda, are right there with the Buddha all the time. So it depends on the character of each arahant, what they do and how much they appear in the texts and how much we know about them. But you can Google them, you can learn from the books. That's maybe something that you might find inspiring. Try out for yourself. When I was a young monk, I would read a lot about the arahants in the time of the Buddha, because it gives you some energy, some ideas how to practice. You get ideas about some of the wrong turns you can take in the practice. And those five ascetics, they all took a wrong turn in the beginning. They rejected the Buddha, but very quickly they realized their mistake and came back on track. But we probably all have those moments where we get a wrong view or go in the wrong direction. So you can learn a lot from reading about their lives and recollecting them. So I'd encourage you to do that.
Sadhu Luang Por. Next question. Dear Ajahn, does proper attention mean to contemplate all things with their three characteristics?
Depends on the context, I think. You might say ultimately that is the aim, is to focus the mind and thoroughly become aware of the three characteristics of existence in both physical form and mentality, body and mind. But depends what we're talking about. In the beginning of practice, maybe you're recollecting sila, and just understanding the difference between skillful, wholesome actions of body and speech and unskillful that lead to suffering. And not so much recollecting the three characteristics or developing that meditation, vipassana meditation, but just seeing what is wholesome, what is unwholesome in our behavior, and acting accordingly, abandoning the unwholesome, cultivating the wholesome. Recollecting different things, different aspects, like recollecting karma, cause and effect, one thing that leads to another, what happens. Ultimately, we are, even when we recollect karma, we're recollecting the three characteristics as well. But in the beginning, just learning about cause and effect, perhaps, and so on. Learning how to restrain body and mind, compose the body and mind in meditation, and develop a meditation object such as Buddhanusati, as I was talking about tonight. You can always use a reflection on impermanence or not self at any time in your practice. But maybe, there are those times when you're not reflecting on the three characteristics and you're just cultivating mindfulness on an object such as the Buddha, recollection of the Buddha. But as you do that, there'll be times when hindrances come into your thinking and stop you recollecting the Buddha. You get angry, you have desire for some sensual object, you're sleepy, you're worried. And recollection and use of the contemplation of the three characteristics in one form or another can help. So Aen Cha, his favorite kind of teaching technique was to say, well, contemplate the uncertainty of your mind. Whether you're recollecting the Buddha, practicing anapanasati, going about your business in daily life, going to work, you're with a family, whatever. it's not sure, is it? Your mind, your state of mind, the mental states arising are not sure. They're not certain. They change. And you can use that characteristic to help you be more composed in your daily life, to bring your mind to the Dhamma, to calm the mind, let go of hindrances, but also for the deepest levels of vipassana insight into any aspect of body and mind, you can use it. So something as simple as it's not sure as a reflection is a very simple tool, but very effective. There are many others you could use, but I'm just giving you this as an example to say, well, you can use reflection on impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, not self, the three characteristics, at any time in your practice, if they work, if they help.
Another question. Mental karma has more weight than physical karma. However, most of the time when we act, we already have the intention developed. Therefore, can we not say that actually when a physical karma is made, it also contains or combines its mental karma already?
Of course, mind is the forerunner of all action, karma, good and bad. So that's why we focus our attention back on the mind so much. We meditate, we train, cultivate. Sila, Samadhi, Panya is all feeding back to training and purifying this mind from greed, anger, and delusion. But like you say, every act of karma, good and bad, is under and has mental intention behind it, or volition. Karma is volitional action, intentional action. So training the mind and the state of the mind and the view we have and what's going on in the mind is the most important karma in the end. However, physical karma and then verbal karma is hugely important because we're making it every day and it can be very obstructive to training the mind. You can do things that make it very difficult for you to train with the mind. Say, one might be if you never make any physical effort to hear the Dhamma, go and meet with Dhamma teachers or read books or whatever to get the information of the Dhamma, well, you're not going to understand much about the Buddhist path for training the mind, are you? The physical act of not doing or even turning against the Dhamma or doing things that take you away from the Dhamma or disrespect the Dhamma or block you from gaining access to the Dhamma, that's going to be a very powerful karma. It will begin from the mind, of course, but the actual physical action will also be very powerful. So the Buddha pointed out, if you're born and you come in contact with teachers, good teachers, but you don't make use of that, you don't respect or value teachers, be careful, because maybe you're using up your past good karma, and then next life you may not be born and meet with good teachers, maybe for a long time, many lives, and so on. So physical and verbal karma is hugely important, but it all stems back to the mind. And if you want to make quick good karma and quickly purify your mind, do a lot of meditation. Cultivate the Noble Eightfold Path, and particularly mindfulness, right effort, and develop states of calm, and then develop insight, because that's what will quickly change your mind for the better.
Next question. There seems to be a general opinion that a Subba meditation has to be done with caution. If we truly get an insight into non-self, could that be a terrifying experience if the mind is not prepared to accept that? Is there a preparatory meditation object that has to be followed before doing a Subba?
Well, it's hard to generalize here. It does depend on the character of each individual. But generally speaking, yes, there's a note of caution when practicing body contemplation, and particularly a suppa or contemplation of the repulsiveness or the unattractiveness of the human body, because it can be quite depressing because you're going against the general trend of our own mind and the world itself, which is promoting beauty, sensuality, lust, attachment, obsession, addiction. And then something like body contemplation is really going against that in a different direction. So it's hard work. Because it's hard work, we get mentally tired. And when we're mentally tired, sometimes we also feel disappointed, depressed if we're not careful. That's one of the dangers, just as in the time of the Buddha, when the monks did a lot of asuppa, but they weren't keeping their mind in a kind of relaxed, wholesome, happy state. So it made them quite depressed, and they got someone to help them to commit suicide. And then the Buddha started teaching anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing, just as a more calming meditation object. So my personal experience is, well, you need some meditations that help to calm, relax the mind, bring up the sense of well-being, to support the investigation of the body through body contemplation and asuppa, meditation on the unattractiveness of the body. For me, I use the breath meditation, but also the 4 Brahma Viharas: kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, equanimity, because these all uplift the mind, calm the mind, so that it can accept and has a bit of energy to do the asuppa meditation without getting too overwhelmed or depressed by it. And I do know some monks, some practitioners who've found asuppa quite hard work, and it has made them irritable, depressed, not usually for very long, but enough for it to become something that they have to work out how to do their body contemplation and their suppa meditation without becoming depressed. Temporarily it becomes an obstacle, and that's quite common. There are a few rare individuals who seem to really get on well by contemplating the body as a meditation from day one. And it makes them very peaceful, and they don't need to develop so much anapanasati or metta. The body contemplation and even contemplating themselves as a corpse brings them great serenity, peace, happiness. They don't have problems with the repulsiveness of the body, bringing up feeling of fear, revulsion, and so on. But these individuals are quite rare. Most people will find there are times where they have profound insights arise into the impermanent nature of the world, themselves, their body, or the repulsive nature of the body, and people experience sometimes some strong revulsion, strong what we say nibbida, where the mind really turns away from things, or sometimes is almost shocked by seeing the stark reality that there is nothing to be clung to in this world as self. So insights into not self can at first be a little bit shocking or confronting. And it's possible that can lead to the practitioner kind of not wanting to go there for a while, not wanting to practice in that way for a little while until they've adjusted to the shock or that feeling of fear or the revulsion or the turning away that they had. Not everyone. Some people cope very well and they're very well adjusted from day one, but some people find they have these experiences where they're just in kind of shock because there's really nothing for the mind to cling on to as self, and there's no, the implications are that you can't find happiness anywhere in this world. In the normal things you might consider as happiness, say like love, relationships, family, wealth, pleasures of different kinds, none of that is seen as satisfying or to be clung to. So then the mind is going, what can I cling to? So it can be quite confronting at first, but you just have to be very patient with that and use some wisdom to see the impermanence, even of the emotions that come up with the insight. Maybe also to balance your practice, developing faith in the Buddha, the compassion of the Brahmaviharas, and so on, to cope with any strong insights that arise for the practitioner. So I wouldn't say give up your practice, but just press on and be ready. There are sometimes different insights bring different results with them, but keep contemplating using the contemplation of impermanence, not self, that we've developed so far. Keep using that, and I think you should be all right.
Sadhu Luang Por. Another question. Dear Luang Por, thank you very much for the Dhamma sharing. My question is, should one observe 8 precepts when going for a pilgrimage trip to India? I understand there are lots of walking and climbing to do. Appreciate Ajahn's thoughts.
It's all not sure, not certain. Some people go to India and they keep the 5 precepts and have a very joyful time, insightful time. Many people will keep the 8 precepts, and perhaps that's a good thing to consider if you are going on a pilgrimage. You start by setting yourself a target. So you say, well, can I keep the 8 precepts? Before you dismiss that as an option, consider, can I do it? And it helps if you've got other people willing to keep the 8 precepts with you, and a teacher maybe, because keeping the 8 precepts keeps you really focused on the practice. Going on pilgrimage can be done as like a retreat, even though you're traveling. You do morning, evening chanting, meditation sessions, listening to Dhamma, do chanting, and keep 8 precepts. Many people have done that and found it very, very beneficial, very helpful. So that might be the model or the ideal for a lay practitioner. But everyone's different. Some people have physical ailments and illness or injury. I was on one pilgrimage to India, and most people were keeping the 8 precepts, but one older lady wanted to go. She's a very weak, frail person, had a lot of physical issues. So she was keeping 5 precepts, and that was fine. And you said about, oh, there's a lot of walking and climbing hills. Well, you have choices in when you go on pilgrimage. You still have choices how much walking you do, where you go. And this lady wanted to go up Kichagutta mountain, where the Buddha has the Kandakuti on top. It's a very atmospheric place. Most people go up there and feel, oh, yes, this must have been where the Buddha lived and practiced for a while. They find it very inspiring, very good place to go and worship, meditate. So everyone wanted to go up, but this lady clearly couldn't make it. She was limping and very weak. So they hired her, some locals, to carry her up on a chair. And she did it. And she got to the top and she's very happy, and the locals made some money. So there's always something you can do in most situations. Even if you're very ill, you may not be able to keep 8 precepts. Maybe you can only keep 5 precepts, but there's always different options available. I wouldn't rule out anything. If you have faith, you get energy, you get joy, then you tend to put that into your pilgrimage, whether you keep the 5 or the 8 precepts. I think you could find it could be a very beneficial time for you and others.
Sadhu Luang Por. Another question. Dear Luang Por, if I'm having unpleasant thoughts about the opposite gender, how can I use Buddha Nusati to overcome that? Sometimes I feel it's hard to practice Buddha Nusati, as the Buddha being a high being that I read in books. Recollecting the qualities of the Buddha may require some imagination. Can Luang Por explain how I can apply that to my situation?
It's the first part of the question, yeah, how to overcome unpleasant thoughts about the opposite sex, was it?
Yes, correct.
Well, any meditator using any meditation technique will have to encounter this. Not sure how you define unpleasant thoughts, whether you're meaning lustful thoughts, or it could be aversion as well. That's also unpleasant. So if you're in a relationship, you probably will know you swing between the two. You love them one day and you hate them the next, then you love them again. So if you're in any form of relationship, you have plenty of food for both samatha, such as buddhanusati or anapanasati meditation, and vipassana, contemplating the ups and downs and the arising and ceasing of different mental states. But maybe you're single. I don't know your situation. And, single people will have lust as well and anger as well. So in the end, we're all human beings with 5 khandhas, a body and mind. And our aim is to tame this mind, to bring it under control so that we can really see the Dhamma and free our mind from the craving and attachment that feeds our suffering. And the Buddha compared, the practice to the taming, like the taming of an elephant. We're taming the mind. So all the techniques we use are for this. So buddhanusati, like you say, you're thinking of the Buddha, the teacher. Sometimes we get caught into that kind of, the Buddha is so superior and so special, unique, and so much parami that we feel the Buddha and us are just too far apart. So some people find it counterproductive, but one reflection is we say the Buddha must have been born for many lifetimes previously to become a Buddha, and in all those lifetimes he was struggling just like we're struggling with a sleepiness and an unruly mind and anger and lust. And the Buddha, we know in previous lives, obviously from the texts, we don't know absolutely that they're true, that they're the word of the Buddha, but they could well be because they seem very relatable, and modern practitioners have very similar issues. So the meditator who attains samadhi but then sees the beautiful girl and all his samadhi disappears is a very common thing that I think has been going on for thousands of years. The monk, I have a friend who once told me a story of his meditation, his walking meditation all day long, 8 hours of walking meditation. His mind went into such a deep state of samadhi. He just felt so light. He was like literally floating up and down as he walked, so peaceful, no distractions, nothing bothering him. But he said he would have a problem when he sat down to meditate. He couldn't maintain the same level of mindfulness and effort. And he sat down to meditate after this many hours of walking meditation. He had a state of samadhi, he was very bright. But he started to become sleepy. So then he lay down to sleep, to rest. And as he entered sleep, his mind left his body. And he said his mind left the body, and it's like he starts to float around the monastery. So his body is lying there, and his mind is now floating around like a drone, a modern drone. And he could see what other people were doing in the monastery, because it wasn't that late at night. He was tired, but he was doing this floating around. I seem to remember it was like 9 o'clock at night or something. And he could actually prove it in a way, because later he could tell other monks what they were doing, where they were, who was talking to who was meditating. He could tell them because he could see them as he went around the monastery. But then curiosity, or you might say his lust, got the better of him. So off he went out of the monastery and started floating over the local village. As he's floating over the local village and it's the evening time, he could see people bathing. And in those days, some people would bathe outside their house. They'd have an area, behind their house, maybe walled off, but they'd have a jar of water and they'd throw water over them. And so he saw one beautiful young girl bathing in the open. He floated over, he could see her. Lust arose, and straight away his mind fell back to his body, back in the monastery with a clunk. He said, it's so fast and so painful. The mind just rushed back into the body. All the samadhi was gone, dissolved, because lust overtook him, and he's just obsessed with this girl he'd seen bathing. And that's quite a common experience for meditators. They see somebody who stimulates lust in them, and then they can't enter their samadhi anymore, at least for a while. So this is one reason we have to practice contemplating the unattractiveness of the body in whatever way it works, going through the 32 parts of the body, doing your own self-autopsy, contemplating yourself as a corpse, skeleton, whatever works. It's a big topic. I can't go into it here, but we contemplate the body and the unattractiveness or the repulsiveness of the body to counter lust. So sooner or later, all meditators will have to do that. But recollecting the Buddha also brings out other qualities. So one is, it helps to bring up sense of shame, understanding of what is wholesome and unwholesome karma, and a fear of that, the unwholesome karma that can overcome your mind, and sense of shame. So like if you think of the Buddha, you think, oh, if the Buddha was here and I'm sitting here meditating, thinking with lust about somebody, the shame may come up and you think, oh, I can't do that. If the Buddha was here, or I'd be so embarrassed. So thinking of the Buddha can help drive away lust, anger, fear, worry, and so on. It can work like that. This is on the level of the hindrances. On the level of the deeper attachment to lust, anger, and fear and delusion, we really need to develop vipassana on the highest level, insight into impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, not self. Nevertheless, Buddhanussati is a very good reflection to bring up. Even for lust, it can work, can help.
Sadhu Luang Por. We have about 2 more questions. So the next one is, Dear Luang Por, thank you so much for your teachings. As you mentioned about taking care of Luang Por Cha, I am curious about how the caregivers, how the Ajahns knew how to take care of such an extremely ill patient.
We learned on the job, on the job training. So I spent the first part of my monk's life learning to be a nurse, basically. We had some good teachers. We both had doctors and nurses, staff from the hospitals, and a number of doctors would come to the monastery on a daily basis, and more would come if there was an emergency. And occasionally Ajahn Cha was taken into the hospital. So again, you learned more about care, disease control, cleanliness, infection control, all of the normal things. Obviously, we weren't trained nurses, but you learned a lot, partly because people paid attention. They were interested. They wanted to care for their teacher because they loved and respected the teacher. We also had some good monks like Ajahn Pabakro, the American monk. He's no longer a monk, but at the time he set up a very good system for caring for Luang Por Cha, and he had some knowledge from his time in the army. So he was a very good trainer of other monks. Luang Por Liam was also a very sharp, insightful monk in training other monks in caring for Ajahn Cha. And because his meditation was so good, and there were a few others whose meditation was very good, such as Luang Por Anan, Luang Por Piak, and so on. Some of the monks whose meditation was good also had very sharp insights into Luang Por Cha and where he was at and what he needed. But particularly Luang Por Liam, who had the job of running the monastery for Luang Por Cha and overseeing the care of Luang Por Cha, often he seemed to be one step ahead of everyone else. And so he would turn up just before the emergency, or as the emergency was unfolding, or help was needed, or a decision needed to be made. He would often be there seemingly without anyone telling him. He seemed to know a lot of things going on without anyone telling him. Obviously, he discussed the care of Luang Por Cha as well, but he always seemed to be one step ahead of everyone, very sharp and insightful in how to care for Luang Por Cha, what was needed. But also the benefit of Sangha is you had a huge community of monks, each with their own insight and understanding. So they weren't all trained doctors and nurses, but they had a respect for Ajahn Cha, which meant they could come together and discuss. And often the majority would come to a decision. You know, sometimes there may be one or two dissenting voices, but over time you'd get a majority decision on any change in the level of care or what to do in different situations. They were using a consensus system, and everyone wanted the best for Ajahn Chah. So usually it led to a smooth and good outcome. And the doctors were also obviously involved and respected, and they would give their opinion, but they'd also defer to the Sangha as well, because they knew Ajahn Chah was a monk, and they knew Ajahn Chah would want his Sangha to be involved in the care of him. But it was a group effort, and that must have had been one factor in why Ajahn Chah lasted in that state so long, is because there was a huge Sangha and lay community, including medical professionals, caring for him with genuine love, respect, surrounding him. So he always had support. And obviously we gained from that situation, we gained by making good karma, looking after him, learning things. And he didn't need us. We were the ones who were benefiting from being with him.
Luang Por. Next question. Dear Luang Por, may you be well. How do we deal with papancha or proliferation? How do we reduce proliferation? Thank you.
Anything that brings up mindful awareness in the present moment will help. Obviously, some wise reflection will also help. But probably number one, put your effort into establishing mindfulness. And usually when we say papancha, we mean this endless proliferation of mind based on conceit, views, sense of self in different situations. And we usually mean when we're thinking a lot. Actually, papancha is probably going on all the time for the normal, untrained, unenlightened mind. But we tend to notice it when it becomes more extreme. So we say, oh, I've got a lot of papancha at the moment. So when it's more extreme, it becomes more impinging on the mind. So what can we do at that time? Well, today I'll be giving you a few examples what you can do. Recollect the Buddha is a very good method for cutting through papancha. You know, depending on what you're proliferating and thinking about, if it's something that's coming from strong desire, greed, obsession with something, or think of the Buddha, recite the word Buddho, 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 that can cut through it. And maybe the sense of shame will help if it's something more unwholesome that you're thinking. Maybe it bring up humility if you've got a lot of pride and conceit feeding your papancha. Effort also, you recollect the Buddha, you get strength of mind, and the effort comes from the faith in the Buddha. You think of the Buddha as example, he's sitting under the Bodhi tree all night, he's meditating and practicing for many years and many lifetimes until he's a Buddha. He had the supreme effort, you know, no one can match the effort of a Buddha. When you think of the Buddha, you get energy. Say, well, he could do it, I must do it. If you're being lazy, or you're sleeping or lying around when you could meditate, you're sitting there indulging, fantasizing when you could restrain your fantasy and bring your mind to contemplate something or meditate on an object. You think of the Buddha, you maybe can do it. Whereas if you forget the Buddha, then the papancha takes over, doesn't it? So recollection of the Buddha is a very good one. Ajahn Chah also said, recollect death. If you've got endless papancha, endless thinking based on a sense of self, just remind yourself, what if I die right now? Do I want to die with a mind that's so caught up in all its mental proliferation, the agitation, the lack of peace? Do I want to die like that? As you recollect death, brings your mind to the present moment, cuts through these things. So these are just a few examples. There's a lot more we could talk about, but for now, maybe I'll just leave you with that.
Sadhu Luang Por. Our last question for tonight. Dear Ajahn, thank you very much for your kind reflections. When I meditate, I notice tensed areas repeatedly happening in the body. Can Ajahn please give me some advice? With metta and gratitude.
Yeah, I think that's very common. There's different reasons for it. Some are more physical. Maybe you're just tired. And when you're tired and you're putting forward effort to sit still, concentrate your mind on an object, it can bring up tension because you're physically tired, weak. Your effort is reflected, it brings up some tension. You know, the effort, extra effort you make to sit still, sit up, concentrate your mind can bring up tension. Sometimes the tension is more mental. Maybe you're just trying too hard, so your body tenses up. If you're trying to focus on the breath, maybe sometimes people try too hard, and so they get pain around the area where they're concentrating. So they pain around the nose or the forehead or in the chest. Sometimes it's what we call vibhaka karma, it's resultant karma, in that you're experiencing a mental state, a feeling being triggered or conditioned from the past. And as you're meditating, it comes up. So it may be displayed in tension in the body in some parts. So a very common one is tension around the heart area, to do with any kind of anger, hatred, dissatisfaction, strong emotions, bring up tension in the heart area. Some things are more habitual. It can be like, you spend all day crouched over a computer or something day after day. So you get certain muscle tensions that you might relieve with, massage and exercise and things. But when you meditate, it comes out. So you notice, oh, I've got tension in the neck or the back. And it may not be the meditation is doing it. It's just you're starting to observe your own body more closely. So you notice tension. Hunger can lead to tension, lack of sleep. In the end, there's many reasons. So you have to kind of experiment and investigate for yourself cause and effect in your body, whether it's a more physical thing, maybe even illness or an injury, or a more mental thing to do with your own attitude and thinking, the mood that you're developing at that time, or could just be old stuff coming up, memories and past experiences coming up. As you meditate, your mind is settled down, and then these past experiences come in, and you can see how quickly tension in the body is triggered by a certain mental state, particularly anger, but also fear, lust as well. Extreme emotions will often express themselves physically as well as mentally. Plenty to study, and you could say meditation and developing mindfulness insight it's a way of learning about yourself, your body and your mind. So you will become more aware of things that you didn't notice perhaps before.
Sadhu Luang Por. So if there are no further questions, that may be our last question. And no more questions, Luang Por.
That's probably enough for tonight. We'll leave it there. Thank you for listening. I haven't seen anyone, so I'm just trusting that you're all out there listening. I don't know. But anyway, we'll see you next time and wish you well. In the meantime, may the blessings of Buddha Dhamma Sangha guide you and protect you.
Sadhu, sadhu.